Welcome, and I really appreciate you taking the time this evening to watch this presentation. So I did have a couple of things I wanted to mention at the beginning. One is that this presentation is being recorded, and so I just wanted everyone to know that, so that you were aware of it. And what we hope to do is to post this to the West Shore YouTube page once it's done. I suspect that would probably be maybe by tomorrow. Not tonight necessarily, but okay.
Yeah.
All right. And I also wanted to just point out a few things that are coming up. Next week on Monday at 12:30, and then again at 7 o'clock in the evening, there will be a speaker who's an author, award-winning historian named Dr. Alan Gallet, who's going to talk about his recent book, which is a biography of Sir Walter Raleigh. And so if you're interested in that, you could go to the Humankind WSCC.org site, where our focus this year is the British Isles. And we came up with this topic because of a survey that was completed by students, members of the community. And so our whole year of presentations will address the British Isles. And they'll be on Zoom this year. And so hopefully people all over would be able to participate. One other thing that I like to point out is, so this coming Monday is Dr. Gallet, and then an artist named Philip Hartigan will be presenting on September 29th. And so those are just two of the events that will be coming up. So I also wanted to say Happy Constitution Day. Today is Constitution Day because this is the day, September 17th, when the 55 delegates to the Constitutional Convention took their final vote to adopt the Constitution under which we live today. And so part of the reason for this presentation is to focus on issues of American history, First Amendment rights, and things like that. And so this presentation is partially in honor of Constitution Day. So this idea or issue of the Confederate flag and monuments and things like that, well, I wanted to kind of start with an approach. And so it's really quite complicated. And there is a lot of emotion involved in some cases, but it's an important topic that we address. So there are two things that I'll kind of come back to throughout the course of the evening. And so one is, if a monument was created and put into place, well, who was in power? Because the person or the group that's in power probably has a particular message. And that message sometimes changes over time. And then secondly, it would be, what was the purpose of that monument? Because depending upon when something was put into place, it could be there to celebrate something, it could be there to try to intimidate others. And so those are two important concepts, I think, to keep in the back of your mind. So, public monuments are important. They go back to the ancient Greeks and Romans. They tell a story. The Archum Constantine is shown there on the left, and this was an arch put into place by one of the Roman emperors to commemorate his victories. They didn't have 30-second commercials back in the 300s AD when Constantine was around. And so instead, they built things like this, public monuments to commemorate their celebrations or their achievements. On the right, we see the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, which was put into place by Napoleon, again, to show how great he was and his achievements as a military leader. Here we see some American monuments. And I don't know if it's big enough or not. I could go like this. So we've got the Lincoln Memorial, larger than life. The man who was who fought to free slaves. We've got this that says something about our country and one of our greatest leaders. We also see here the Washington Monument that towers over Washington, D.C. You can go anywhere in D.C. and try to get your perspective on things by where the Washington Monument is. Just as George Washington was the giant who towered over the country and who was the father of our country, the Washington Monument towers over the city of Washington, D.C. Well, we can also look at some other monuments. Here we see the Vietnam Memorial. Do you notice that in a way, I don't know how many people have been to the Vietnam Memorial and seen it, But notice it's almost like it's underground. It includes the names of the fallen men and women who fought valiantly in Vietnam. Well, it commemorates them, and it's underground just as if they were buried. And if you get close to it, you can see those names very closely and maybe even see yourself in the wall. And so these are public monuments that tell a story, that try to commemorate things, to try to evoke memories. I don't know if anyone's seen Plymouth Rock. However, you can go see it. There's a huge celebration for it. There's like an arch and a nice a position for it. It's a little bit disappointing, quite frankly. But anyway, I think it's worthwhile to go see. On the right, we see the eternal flame commemorating John Kennedy's final, where John Kennedy was buried. Kennedy saw the eternal flame at Gettysburg, and he wanted to recreate it at his own gravesite. Yes, his life was taken too early, yet his spirit lives on, and this flame is we see this flame forever. It's always on, just as maybe the goals of John Kennedy continue, even though he has passed away. There has been controversy in the past with public monuments. The Franklin Roosevelt Memorial was put into place a few years back, and initially it did not show Roosevelt in a wheelchair. If you know, President Roosevelt, he lived most of his adult life in a wheelchair, yet there are very few photos of it. Well, eventually a second statue showing him in that wheelchair was added. I think, one thing maybe to keep in mind here too is that, if you're in court, you're supposed to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Well, they told the truth with the image up top, but maybe the full truth is shown by the second statue that was added to the memorial that helps to tell a fuller story about President Roosevelt. So here's where I'm going to kind of ask for a little audience participation. Does anybody want to guess what this is? Maybe you could put this into the Q&A. I'm going to stop sharing so maybe I can see. I'll put the image back up.
Nobody wants to give it a shot?
Right, Renee, you want to give it a shot?
Well, it looks a lot like the Washington Monument to me.
Yes, it does. Okay. Well.
Yeah, Jessica says Washington Monument. So that's the guess that we're going with.
Okay. All right. It's actually the Jefferson Davis Memorial. This commemorates his birthplace, and Jefferson Davis was the president of the Confederacy. It's kind of an interesting history. It commemorates, Jefferson Davis, and it was paid for with private funds, but now it's part of the Kentucky State Park system. What's also interesting is that Jefferson Davis was born in Kentucky, and so too was Abraham Lincoln. They were born about 100 miles apart from one another. And so we've got these two historic locations actually pretty close to one another. And each of them tells a story, these public monuments. Here's something else. For some people, the image here on the top, the flag, represents their heritage, an independent spirit, a focus on states' rights as opposed to federal authority. It also commemorates sports at the University of Mississippi. But for others, this represents something else. racism and white supremacy, support for slavery, and treason. Every person who fought for the Confederacy committed treason against the United States. And so some people would focus on those aspects of this image. So, what is this image? We hear about the Confederate flag and the fact, that it's been used a lot. We see this image. Well, actually, the image that you see most often, that most people refer to as the Confederate flag, was the battle flag of the Army of Northern Virginia. And so if it's square, that's what its original purpose was. On the right, you see a very similar flag, but that's a rectangle. And so that would be the battle flag for the Army of Tennessee starting in 1863. If you want to look at the history of the Confederate flag, well, there were actually 3 different Confederate flags. On the left, you see the first, the so-called stars and bars, and you see the circle of those stars. And then the so-called stainless banner in the middle. And then toward the end of the Civil War, you see the so-called blood-stained banner. And you notice that has the cross with the stars, similar to the battle flag of Northern Virginia. So really, there's no single Confederate flag. So again, let's go back to this idea, these ideas that I tried to address at the beginning. The issue of the Confederate flag is complicated. Who was in power when the monument was created? And what was its purpose? Okay, all right, so again, try to keep that in mind. This has been a topic that historians have dealt with for quite some time. I happen to be an historian, and the American Historical Association has come out with some guidelines and some ideas. Well, what they've argued in part with the monuments is that most of those monuments were not put into place in the years immediately after the Civil War, the use of Confederate monuments and a lot of the use of the flag. In fact, most of those weren't put into place until the late 1800s and early 1900s. Their purpose? Well, those memorials had the purpose to try to intimidate African Americans, and they also came back after many years of not seeing those flags very much at all, and a lot of that imagery. Just as the civil rights movement began a reprise and people began to fight for civil rights, you see many more uses of the Confederate flag. So in the middle here, the image that you see, that's taken when in 1957, when Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas was being integrated. Mobs of whites yelled racial epithets at the African Americans who were going to school there. Above that, you see the use of do I dare say Confederate flag? I mean, technically it's the flag of Northern Virginia, but I think you get the point here. That flag became increasingly linked to people who were opposed to integration. And just in case, I don't know if hopefully everybody can see this, but you've got peaceful protesters who are protesting against Jim Crow laws and segregation, and you've got someone who apparently is against that, and so he's holding that Confederate flag, or that Confederate flag there. And that's in the context of the civil rights movement. There was a political party, a single issue political party, formed in 1948. The single issue was to maintain segregation. And Strom Thurmond was the nominee of that organization. And so here you see it's focused on states' rights. Here you see there were not just in, he was from South Carolina, not just in South Carolina, but you saw in many other southern states, you saw the use of this Confederate imagery and the emergence of these citizen councils that were there to support segregation. And here you see a button for Strom Thurmond, who was running for president. So we can also explore and look at some of the state flags. So the bottom left, you see the state flag from Georgia, and that was the flag from 1920 to 1956. Well, they decided to change their flag in 1956 in response to a Supreme Court ruling in 1954 that called for the integration of schools. And that was the Brown versus Board of Education ruling, if you're familiar with that. Then eventually, Georgia decided to get rid of that Confederate imagery and instead go adopt a different flag in 2004, and you see that one there. Now, it's also kind of interesting when you compare the Georgia state flag from 2004 to the flag of the Confederacy. And you can still see some similarities in that imagery. Other states have done similar things as well. This is the current Mississippi state flag. And you can see that this has the stars and the bars, there. And it incorporates aspects of the Confederate flag as well as the flag of Northern Virginia. Now, there's going to be some current events that impact the Mississippi state flag here in just a minute. But I just wanted to show how we've got some state flags that include some of this imagery, going back to the Civil War era. There's a monument that I wanted to mention here too. This was placed in New Orleans, right on Canal Street, in a really prominent spot. And this was to commemorate the Battle of Liberty Place, which took place in 1874. This was a complicated event, but I'll try to address it in layman's terms, I guess. There was a disputed election in 1874, and the person who was elected was a Republican, and there were several former slaves who were elected to the state legislature, and many whites who supported equal treatment for former slaves. Well, the members of a so-called White League overthrew that, and there was a huge conflict. They were supporters of white supremacy, and about 100 people were injured, and 32 people were killed as there was a physical conflict between the White League and supporters of the Republican governor who had been elected. He was initially removed from office, but then federal troops came back and they restored order. This monument was put into place to commemorate the Battle of Liberty Place, which was where this conflict took place. Well, in 1932, an inscription was added to this. And so what this inscription said was that, okay, yes, there was this battle that took place in 1874, but what happened is that by 1876, there was a new election, and this new election recognized white supremacy in the South and gave us our state, one could say, gave us our state back. This monument was designed by whites who were in power to try to celebrate the fact that whites were then back in power, and they were able to reestablish white supremacy in New Orleans as well as all of Louisiana. This was a very controversial monument. In the 1980s, it was moved to a different location, and that white supremacy inscription was removed. Why? Because a different group of people was in power at that time, and they didn't like the fact that this promoted white supremacy. Then, by 1993, it was determined to be a public nuisance, and they added a new inscription. Rather than have this focus on white supremacy, it included a statement, well, this was in honor of Americans on both sides who died. It continued to be a very controversial monument, and in 2016, once again, it had been filled with anti-racist graffiti, and it was just very controversial. So the city council voted to remove it. And since 2017, it's been in storage. How about the Confederate flag at state houses? Well, the Confederate flag was not flown in Alabama at the State House. until 1961. And it was just for a very short time. I believe they're not even sure, if it was like 3-4 days or something like that. But it flew there in honor of the 100th anniversary of the Civil War. Then it was put away. But then they decided to fly it again in 1963, the very day that Robert Kennedy, who was the Attorney General of the United States, went to Alabama to attempt to enroll African Americans at the University of Alabama. And so it was put into place once again in order to try to harken back to the Civil War and issues really of white supremacy. In the 1990s, it was moved to a new location. But then in 2015, it was completely removed to the grounds around the Capitol in Alabama. A similar history is seen with South Carolina and the battle flag. It was first flown on the 100th anniversary of the Civil War. But then in 2000, it was removed from the State House, and it was near the Capitol, but only on the Capitol lawn. And then again in 2015, it was removed. Governor Nikki Haley said that it should be removed. We've got the removal of two symbols of the Confederacy in the same year. So why is that? Well, 2015 is a turning point. Okay? Events in 2015 influenced elected officials, because that was the year that Dylan Roof went to a church meeting. It was like a Bible study, and he killed 9 African Americans in a hope to start a race war. It was within the context of Dylan Roof's activities that many state officials and many throughout the country began to reconsider the Confederate imagery. And you see here, I believe Dylan Roof's Facebook page had a lot of Confederate imagery and things like that. So, the issue of the Confederate flag is complicated. Who is in power influences things, and the purpose is also something that influences the use and remove and putting things in place, but also to remove them. So, all right, Renee, I can maybe pause here for a moment. Does anyone have any questions?
So we haven't gotten any in on the chat, but if anyone does have a question, go ahead and type that in right now and we can address it.
I hope that you can hear me. I feel like I'm yelling, but I feel like the Jerry Seinfeld's friend who co-created Seinfeld, and I'm yelling like what's his name? I can't remember his name. But anyway, I guess there's a question where a hand has been raised.
Hi, Anna.
Can you allow her to unmute? I don't know if you can or not.
I can say ask to unmute. I don't know. It doesn't look.
There we go.
Oh, hi.
Okay, Bill's here.
Yes. Hi, Anna. Do you have a question?
Anna, we can't hear you. Sorry.
If there is a question, we couldn't hear it.
Can you not hear it now? We've got it unmuted.
Oh, there you are.
Now we could hear you.
Okay, can you hear Bill? Bill, speak up hard.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you now.
Yep.
Okay. We all know that there's a lot of interest and controversy over moving monuments.
You're cutting out again, Bill. Sorry.
What's your question, Bill? Maybe you think. I don't know what's going on here. Type the question. What's your question? What's your question?
Do you agree with the proposed solution that when monuments are removed, we ought to seek to place them in museums that represent our history.
So I think I am not an advocate for removing all sorts of monuments. What I would really like to see
Placed in museums.
Right. I was gonna say if they're if we've got them and if we're gonna preserve them, they should be put in museums. It could also be another idea is to make them inclusive, much more inclusive. And there's actually toward the end of the presentation, I'm hoping to show what was done in Hungary with some things. And so I think absolutely museums rather than on state property. And things like that, I think I would be a much better place for many of those monuments. All right, so I'll go ahead and continue
We also
on.
had, we had another question. So Sonia is saying, when I was in the South in the spring of 2019, there were many small Confederate cemeteries with many Confederate flags. What should be the role of remembering family members in this manner?
Wow, yeah, that's a great question, because you know how I showed the one slide earlier that said it's heritage, it's family. Yeah, so members of so people who fought in the Confederacy, okay, started off as Americans, but then they rejected the U.S. Constitution and took up arms against the United States. And so I think if we tell a full story with that, if we recognize that this was a conflict that really divided Americans, but you know, a private cemetery, you know, and individual grave sites, I think would be something that's different than a state house and a position where the you know, where the government is actually promoting something like this. I think would be it's a great question, but I think we see some differences there with private property versus public property like that.
Great, I think that answers your question.
All right. So in response to Dylan Rook, TV Land pulled its show the TV series Dukes of Hazzard because the Confederate flag was used in an awful lot of imagery. And it was my understanding that the General Lee, which has that, you know, that stars and bars there, that it was difficult to purchase. Like they used to have little toys of the General Lee, and so it was very difficult to get those. And so a lot of people thought, you know, hey, is this going too far? That where we're addressing things like this? Well, let's try to complicate matters. Okay. Well, the whole issue of Confederate monuments and this history of the United States, it's complicated. Slavery is the original sin of our country. Slavery was legal in every single English colony, North, Middle Colony, and South. It was legal everywhere. Even by the 1850s. By the 1850s, there were, you know, just about half of the states were slave states. Slavery was legal in New York until 1827. It didn't end with the American Revolution. Also, there was a lot of compliance on the part of many Northerners on the issue of slavery. Rhode Island was a hotbed of the slave trade, and a lot of the ships that were built in the North that were engaged in the slave trade. And also in the years after the slave trade was prohibited, a lot of the cotton was produced in the South. That cotton was shipped to northern textile mills, and they made profits. And so to say that the issue of slavery was simply a Southern issue really is not telling the full story. How about if we look at Abraham Lincoln, our president who focused on preserving the Union? In 1858, he was morally opposed to slavery, but he declared that he was not, nor had he ever been, in favor of bringing about social and political equality for the white and black races. His views on issues of race and his views on African American voting rights, as well as on whether or not we should fight to end slavery, whether he should issue the Emancipation Proclamation, those were issues that strongly divided him. He was always morally opposed to slavery. However, we see some of his writings and speeches here. So, what do we do? What should we do? President Trump has talked about, hey, this is a slippery slope. We've got some problems in our communities. You can't change history. We should learn from it. If we start taking down certain monuments, who's next? Okay? He argued that it was sad to see the removal of these monuments. Okay? This is an important part of our history, but we also need to remember something as well. The people who fought for the Confederacy fought in defense of slavery, and they committed treason against our country. So it's complicated. There's no solution. You know, Dr. Anderson was mentioning you taking a lot of these and putting them into museums. Because that way we can place context around them. We're not destroying these artifacts. When the Romans, when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, the Romans destroyed numerous temples to Roman gods and goddesses. That was an important piece of history that was lost. And so if we can provide a better context, if we can place these monuments in museums and study them, they're important artifacts in and of themselves. But, you know, here we see one issue. This was a home in Flint that was flying a Confederate flag as well as a Nazi flag. But this was located on private property. And, you know, some of the neighbors were really upset about this. This is from the New York Daily News. And, you know, the neighbors are like, you know, I don't think this is a good idea. And they wanted to try to get their neighbor to take these imagery, you know, these flags down. But there's a key difference here. Okay? This is private property as opposed to a public monument and on like a state house grounds. Here we see previous monuments that were destroyed and torn down. Okay? This was during the American Revolution. So who was in power? Well, you've got rebels, okay, who were declaring their independence against England. And so what was the message that they were trying to make in tearing down this symbol of the monarchy? Well, they were fighting against it. Initially, that statue was put into place to demonstrate the power of the monarchy. And it was torn down by others who gained power to send a message, hey, we're not going to put up with this anymore. I have been lucky enough to visit Dachau, which was a concentration camp. There were over 30,000 people who were murdered there. In Germany, you know, this is just outside of Munich. And so they did not destroy this. They did not tear it down. What they did was they turned it into a museum of remembrance. And so you still see some of the ovens that were used to burn people's bodies. You can still walk the grounds where thousands of people were placed into these camps, and they had tremendous suffering. There's another park that I'd like to mention. This is Memento Park, and this is in Budapest in Hungary. What they did was they took a lot of the statues that had been put into different places in Hungary that were put into place by the communists to try to promote communist imagery because they were in power. They wanted to send a message that, hey, you better follow the party line, so to speak, do I dare say. And so what they did was they took 42 of those statues from the communist era and they put them all in one place. They established a museum with these huge, huge monuments that they preserved in order to try to say, hey, this is what would happen if you allow dictatorship and tyranny to rule. These statues represent that. And it was all part of an educational system. Here's one that I find kind of interesting. Okay, this is a monument in Saratoga, and it's a monument to a brilliant soldier from the Continental Army. But they don't name the soldier who's, for whom this monument is named. They have his boot, but it was Benedict Arnold, who was a brilliant Continental soldier. He was able he was very successful on the field of battle, but then he also committed treason. So they commemorate the contributions of Benedict Arnold at Saratoga, but they don't name him. So this was put into place, interestingly, in 1877, what, about 12 years after the end of the Civil War. I've been to Monticello. I had a wonderful visit there. Well, the issue of Sally Hemings, the woman that Jefferson had a several decade-long relationship, is addressed directly at Monticello. And so for quite some time, it wasn't addressed, but they welcome questions. They even have displays explaining Jefferson's relationship with Sally Hemings. And if you're not familiar with this, Sally Hemings was Jefferson's slave. And they had, after Jefferson's wife died, a few years later, Jefferson started a relationship with Sally Hemings. They had, I believe it was 6 children, 4 lived to adulthood. And interestingly enough, Jefferson was devastated by his wife's death. Sally Hemings was the half-sister of Thomas Jefferson's deceased wife. And so that's probably part of the reason why Jefferson was drawn to Sally Hemings, because she reminded him of his wife, the wife that he missed so much after her death. So I showed this earlier. This is the current Mississippi state flag. It was adopted in 1894, and as I said before, this incorporates some of the aspects of the Confederate flag as well as the battle flag of Northern Virginia. I don't know if people are aware of this or not, but in June of 2020, Mississippi's state legislature voted to remove this flag. They want to replace it with a new one. And so this November, the voters in Mississippi will choose to adopt a new flag or not. What happened is there were about 3,000 entries. People could submit an entry to what the new flag design should be. There was a commission that was set up to judge. I think it was maybe 5 or 6 of the finalists. They took public comment from those, and then eventually this committee chose the image that you see here. And so this November, the voters in Mississippi will decide if they want to go with this. And if they accept it, then we'll have a new flag from Mississippi. If not, they'll go back to the drawing board, they'll get some new images, and they'll try to pick a new image to be represented on the Mississippi state flag. Why was it that after years of controversy, the state of Mississippi, the state legislature decided to change it? Well, this came in the aftermath of the protest following the death of George Floyd. whose death was ruled a homicide. One of the officers was charged with murder, who was involved with his death, and several of the other officers have been charged as well. And so the context in which this change will take place with the Mississippi state flag is influenced by current events. And so that's why you see this change that's potentially right, on the horizon in Mississippi. Here's another issue that I think is interesting. I say there's no single solution to all of these issues. This is a display that's at the state capitol in Texas. Here's, where I would say I'm uncomfortable with some of the Confederate imagery at state-sponsored sites. I'm not an advocate to get rid of all of them. I think museums are a great place for them, but I think you've got to look at things on a case-by-case basis. Here's one that I could be comfortable with, because what we see is that there are 6 flags from the state of Texas on the upper left. Well, maybe just to make sure that you can see this, okay? Okay, so the one of these flags shows what the flag of Texas looked like under Spain. And for a while, it was under the authority of France. Well, and then Mexico had control over Texas for 15 years. And then Texas was its own country. It was the Lone Star Republic. And then you see the Texas flag during the era of the Confederacy. And then you see Texas in the United States. And so what you've got here is an historical display of the different flags of Texas, and it's all telling a particular story. It's telling the story of Texas under the Spanish, the French, Mexico, its own independent country, and then a part of the Confederacy, and then part of the United States. So, historians are still trying to grapple with this. And so, again, the American Historical Association has offered some guidance. These symbols of white supremacy today are still being invoked. And if you remove them, or move them to a new location, that's not changing history or erasing it. Different historians might have a different interpretation of things, but these are decisions that each individual community should make. Hopefully, we can see groups seeking input from historians so that people can understand the facts, why these were put into place, the purpose of them being put into place, and who was in power when those were put into place. As, again, Dr. Anderson was saying, these memorials are artifacts. We really should preserve them. Now, a lot of artifacts are in archives. They're also in museums, but they're important that it's important that the public also be able to see these so that we can have a better understanding of our own nation's history. So, here I included this slide earlier. It's a complicated issue. There's no single solution, but I think it's important to get public input. Well, oh, goodness, I am embarrassed with this, and so let me go back here. I'm not sharing my screen anymore, but anyway, or am I?
Nope, you're good.
Oh, okay. So am I sharing the screen?
Nope.
Okay. All right.
Nope, we just see you.
Yes. Okay. So, just trying to address a controversial and a complicated issue, and I think it's important that we embrace our history. I like that whole idea that we tell the truth, the whole truth. Okay. We shouldn't. We're not simply talking about the founders of the country as being these awful people, but if we put them on a pedestal and we talk about them as having no flaws at all, everyone has flaws. Everybody has flaws. And so we can come to a better understanding of our nation's history by looking at a fuller story. And so anyway, just some thoughts.
Thank you. That's great. Does anyone have any questions? If you want to type them into the chat, or you can also raise your hand and I will unmute you. You can do it that way too. Okay, so we have a long question from Sean.
All right. Is it in? Okay.
Do you see it?
I can see it, yeah. Can everybody see this? Yeah. So, I don't know. So, should I read it? Renee, do you think? Because I don't know if everybody can see this or not.
Yep, they can. They can.
Okay.
I
All
can.
No, we can't.
Oh, you can't see it? Okay, I will read it for you. So Sean is saying, surely an advantage of having a monument in a museum is that the curators can there present a fuller picture of the history of the monument and its meanings, as Professor Nagle demonstrated with his various pictures of the Liberty Square monument, than if the monument were on display on public land. Tougher with the battle flag, not as possible to corral a flag in a museum. A single statue can be isolated and then displayed in sophisticated ways in a somewhat controlled environment. Way more difficult to focus discussion on the meanings of a flag, since its physical manifestations are so diverse and disparate.
Well, it seems to me that you still could, have images of a flag in a public area. Some of those monuments, it could be difficult, but I think of historic White Pine Village and the school where there's a flag from the 1890s, and it's in the back of the room. But that is something. Sometimes I teach a lesson at the one-room schoolhouse, and so I think you're right that it can be difficult, to get the full feeling of it in a space. But maybe you could have one that's on display in order to show some imagery, and then to have some explanation surround that. But you're right, it's not gonna be perfect. If that's got to be a pretty big museum if you've got all the flags and if you've got all these monuments in place, because some of them are quite large. One other thing to do is, how about it, Monument Square is the wrong word. I'm trying to think of the name. Maybe it's Avenue in Charlottesville, where you've got the images of several Confederate leaders and others. How about including Arthur Ashe, an African-American tennis player and activist? Why not include something like him? How about Nat Turner, who led a rebellion, a slave rebellion? I mean, heck, we've seen a TV show and a movie about Spartacus, who was a Roman gladiator who led a slave insurrection. And so why not tell the fuller story by making it more inclusive?
Mm-hmm.
Another question?
No, I'm not typing. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, I'd like to share an experience, Renee and Mike. It's not directly related, but it is related in that we have monuments to honor people. Okay? In the Hall of Congress, every state can have a Democrat and a Republican. And when I was state director of history, arts, and libraries, I get a phone call saying the Republicans want to replace Zachary Chandler and put Gerald Ford in there. And they're going to pay for it. But your job, Anderson, is to find a new home for Zachary Chandler. And so I finally got him into the Detroit Museum.
And you know what I was going to say is you probably didn't put that Zachary Chandler statue at the Gerald Ford Airport or the Gerald Ford Library and Museum.
No.
No, I'm teasing. So no, that's good. Yeah. You know, it's an excellent quandary that we face. Okay, what do we preserve? How do we do that? There's only so much physical space that we can have for these monuments, particularly for monuments like that, as opposed to, you know, if you've got a lot of paperwork that can be digitized maybe, and it doesn't take up as much space. But the point you're making is really important. We have to pick and choose sometimes.
Mhm.
Um,
Are there any, I don't think we have any other
So-
questions. And again, if you have a question, go ahead and either raise your hand or type it into the chat. But do you know, are there any efforts like this happening in Michigan, or any of these kind of decisions being made, or you know, debates being done in Michigan?
So there was a debate over the Columbus statue, I believe, in the Detroit area.
Okay.
And this was in the middle of the summer, and whether or not it should be removed. And I think I don't know if it has been removed, but I think they decided to remove it and to move it to a different location. Does anybody know the final answer on that? I think that's what happened, and I apologize for not having that an answer to that prepared.
Oh, that's okay.
Can I jump in again? We've had that situation in Mason County with the Father Marquette Memorial.
Right, right.
Yes, and so now the Pierre Marquette Memorial was maintained for some time by Pierre Marquette Township, I believe. And so now we've got the association that has been formed, a private group that has raised money and refurbished it. And so that's just within the last year, that it's within the last several months that it's been replaced. And that came up, you know, initially about 2-3 years ago initially.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks for pointing that out. I mean, that's really a local example.
Right. So Sonia asked, do we have any Confederate memorials in the Ludington area?
I know that Lakeview Cemetery has some fallen soldiers, but those are Union soldiers. I'm almost certain, all of them, I believe. And I know that we've got townships named for Union generals, and that. I am unaware of any locally for the Confederacy. Dr. Anderson, you may know this better than me.
I don't know any other, but just kind of an interesting side note. We once had a mayor of Ludington named Hap Smith, and he was a former Confederate soldier.
Oh, okay.
I wonder if anybody else can hear that.
Sean said there is one in Allendale, a statue of a Confederate soldier in the Veterans Park there.
Should we rename Columbus, Ohio? Wow. Well, you really want me to tackle that one, Jessica? You really want to give me not an easy one, but a hardball? I think you know, the American Historical Association, their recommendation, you know, really is to seek input from all parties, allow for a robust discussion, you know, and so and that would be for them, you know, I would think, and that would be the best thing to do, you know. Yeah, renaming things, yeah, it's a good question. Well, you know, I was just hoping to try to address some of these potentially quite controversial issues. And this is Constitution Day. And so Constitution Day commemorates the adoption of our Constitution. Isn't it great that we have the ability to discuss and debate issues like this? That we can say, hey, should an individual be allowed to express themselves and to have something displayed on their private property? How about at the state level? And so I think that this is a good day to address issues such as this. And so I would like to say I appreciate you taking the time to listen to me. I feel like I'm still yelling.
It's okay. That's all right. We actually had one other question here related to the issue of names. Recently, there was a question raised about Montcalm, for whom the county was named. He was a slaveholder and somewhat of a scoundrel. Should we change the name?
Yeah. Oh, Jack, you want to give me a bad time. What do you think, Jack? So, I think that should we change the name of Washington State because George Washington was a slaveholder? Thomas Jefferson owned slaves. I think that changing names is different than telling a fuller story. I like that whole idea of the truth and the whole truth.
Mhm.
Ensuring that you are talking about the accomplishments, but also the failures of people. We're all humans, and humans make mistakes. Some of them can be big, but anyway, I think a robust discussion of things is exactly what's necessary. One based on respect, one based in historical fact. But I see, the Zoom format is a rough one, and I know that it can it can lead to fatigue, and so I just want to say thank you for all of you for taking an hour out of your evening, and I hope that you can enjoy the rest of your evening and take care, and maybe we can continue the discussion in another venue in that. All right.
Sure,
Take care,
absolutely.
everyone.
Thank you all so much.